The story of America's most puzzling house does not begin with shadowy hallways, confusing stairways, or whispered legends about restless spirits. It begins with something far more ordinary: a quiet patch of land on the outskirts of San Jose, a place so unremarkable at first glance that no passerby could have imagined the transformation it would one day undergo. In the late 19th century, when the Santa Clara Valley was still a peaceful landscape of orchards, dusty roads, and scattered farmhouses, there stood a modest 8-room rural home, surrounded by 45 acres of open space. It was the kind of house built with function in mind: simple wooden walls, a wraparound porch, and the faint scent of farmland lingering in the air. Nothing about it suggested that it would one day become the most analyzed, misunderstood, and myth-covered residence in the United States. When Sarah Winchester arrived in California, she was not searching for fame, mystery, or a place to hide from anything supernatural. She was searching for warmth, quite literally. Her health required a gentler climate, and memories of earlier travels to San Francisco guided her back west. As she explored the region with an agent familiar with the Winchester Company, she found herself drawn not to grandeur, but to tranquility. The farmhouse in San Jose offered exactly that: a quiet refuge, private and surrounded by nature, with rolling terrain reminiscent of the Spanish countryside she once admired. The house was not grand, but it felt peaceful. The land held potential, and the absence of neighbors meant she could create something entirely her own, far from the noise and pressure of the East Coast world she had left behind. Her decision to acquire this particular property was not impulsive. It was thoughtful and deeply personal. She wanted a place where she could breathe, think, and perhaps start anew. The spacious acreage whispered possibility: room for gardens, room for expansion, room for ideas that had not yet taken shape. What she purchased was not just a structure, but a canvas, one she could shape with her own hands and imagination. The farmhouse, though small, offered a foundation strong enough to support whatever future designs she might dream up. The open land around it meant that no direction was off limits. She could expand upward, outward, sideways. There were no boundaries except those she chose for herself. In those early days, the house was nothing more than a quiet residence tucked into the landscape. Workers traveled those dusty roads without giving its silhouette a second glance. Local farmers saw it as just another home dotting the valley's patchwork. But beneath its unassuming appearance, the seeds of something extraordinary were beginning to take root. Sarah did not yet know how drastically she would reshape the property, how many years of constant building lay ahead, or how her creative impulses would one day be twisted into ghost stories and sensational tales. All she knew was that this place felt right: an isolated, sunlit piece of California soil where she could shape a future built on craftsmanship, reflection, and the kind of architectural curiosity that had followed her since childhood. What makes this early stage so compelling is the contrast between what the house was and what it would become. This humble farmhouse, quiet and nearly forgotten by the world, would slowly grow into a sprawling, three-dimensional maze of rooms, towers, staircases, balconies, and corridors, its size and complexity unmatched by any private home of its era. Later generations would struggle to separate truth from fiction, convinced the labyrinth was born out of fear rather than imagination. Yet, in its beginning, the house was nothing more than a peaceful retreat chosen by a woman looking for comfort, warmth, and a new start. The ground on which she stood was ordinary. The future she envisioned was anything but. The farmhouse at Lanada Villa was the first brushstroke on a canvas that would expand far beyond anyone's expectations, setting into motion the birth of an architectural legend whose origins were far more human and far more hopeful than the rumors that would later eclipse them. What began as a quiet farmhouse soon evolved into a sanctuary where architecture became both language and therapy. Once Sarah settled into Lanada Villa, the property's calm rhythm allowed her mind to drift toward possibilities she had long kept buried beneath responsibility and expectation. The 8-room structure, though humble, awakened something familiar in her, the same curiosity she once felt while collaborating on her home in Connecticut, the same satisfaction she found in choosing materials, studying layouts, and imagining the flow of light through a room. Here in San Jose, removed from the pressures of society and the noise of crowded cities, that interest stirred again, no longer limited by tradition or by anyone else's plans. The house felt like an invitation, a project waiting to be shaped, and she responded to it not with hesitation, but with genuine eagerness. The earliest changes were modest but intentional. Before the first wall was moved or the first foundation extended, she began sketching ideas, loose, instinctive drawings that hinted at broader ambitions. These sketches were less about creating a grand estate and more about rediscovering her own creative voice. They captured graceful lines, expanded rooms, windows added where she felt the sunlight should gather, and gentle transitions between spaces designed for comfort and ease. With every thought put to paper, she moved closer to transforming the farmhouse into a personal workshop, a place where imagination dictated the rules rather than convention. To bring her ideas to life, she needed hands capable of shaping wood, brick, and plaster with the same care she devoted to planning. The first workers she hired were local carpenters, skilled craftsmen who understood the region's building materials and were familiar with California's climate. These men were the beginning of what would eventually become a loyal, full-time crew living directly on the property. They had no idea that the job they were accepting would stretch not for weeks or months, but for decades. In those early days, they simply saw themselves helping renovate a farmhouse for a quiet woman with a precise eye for detail and an unexpected enthusiasm for design. As the team settled in, routines formed naturally. Each morning, Sarah would walk the grounds with rolled sketches in hand, discussing the day's tasks with calm authority. She listened to advice when needed, yet kept the final vision firmly in her grasp. She directed changes with the confidence of someone who understood not only what she wanted, but why. Even though she lacked formal training, she possessed an instinct for proportion, light, and flow, qualities architects spent years cultivating. Her crew quickly realized that she wasn't simply a patron, she was the driving force behind every decision. The first additions to the house grew from necessity and curiosity rather than extravagance. A room would be expanded to capture the sun's warmth in the afternoon. A hallway would be shifted to improve access between wings. A modest upper level began to take shape as she imagined new uses for the space. Workers added porches, widened entryways, opened walls, and extended foundations, transforming the once cozy structure into a dynamic framework that seemed ready to grow at a moment's notice. Nothing she did felt grandiose, at least not yet, but every change suggested that the house was becoming more than a residence. It was turning into a living sketchbook. As the crew observed her work habits, they noticed that she treated each modification as part of a larger, ever-changing vision. If a room no longer met her expectations, she reimagined it. If a space felt too confined, she altered it. If the angle of the sun changed with the seasons and revealed a better place for a window, she redesigned the wall entirely. Her decisions were not spontaneous whims. They were measured responses to how the house itself evolved. She allowed the structure to guide her just as much as she shaped it. By the end of these early years, the transformation was unmistakable. Lianada Villa no longer resembled the modest farmhouse she had purchased. It became something far more intriguing, a private creative sanctuary where each new board, pane of glass, and freshly framed doorway carried traces of her personality. Far from society's judgment and free from the limitations that once constrained her, she built not for status, but for fulfillment. The house was no longer simply a place to live. It was becoming a place to dream, to experiment, and to heal, one room at a time. The moment Sarah dismissed the architects marked a turning point in the evolution of her home, a quiet but decisive shift that set Lianada Villa on a path no professional designer could have anticipated. What had begun as a gentle renovation now moved fully into her hands, guided not by blueprints stamped with formal seals, but by instinct, curiosity, and the freedom she had never possessed in earlier chapters of her life. She no longer wanted intermediaries to translate her ideas. She wanted to speak directly to the materials, to the lines of the walls, to the shape of each future room. The architects she initially hired brought structure and convention, but convention was exactly what she wished to escape. Their plans felt rigid, predictable, and too far removed from the intuitive relationship she was forming with the house. So, she let them go and stepped completely into the role she had quietly desired for years. With the architects gone, the house ceased to follow a traditional building logic. It began responding to her mind in real time. Each morning became a ritual. She gathered her team in the soft California light, sketches tucked under her arm, and walked them through the day's objectives. These gatherings were not formal meetings, but thoughtful conversations carried out on the porch, in a half-built hallway, or under a newly raised beam still smelling of fresh lumber. She explained why a window should shift 2 feet to the left, why a staircase needed to rise at a gentler angle, or why an entire section should be torn down and reimagined. Her crew, once surprised by her precision, eventually came to admire it. They learned that she noticed the smallest details, how morning light entered a room, how airflow shifted at dusk, how footsteps echoed differently depending on the placement of a door. Without a master plan, the house grew not in straight lines, but in a series of thoughtful responses to its own evolving form. A hallway that began as a simple connector gained length when she felt it needed more breathing room. A bedroom expanded because a decorative idea required additional wall space. A staircase shifted direction because she wanted the ascent to feel smoother. At times, her choices puzzled the workers, who were used to methodical designs. But over time, they understood that her approach was not chaotic. It was deeply personal, a process in which intuition replaced drafting boards and inspiration replaced architectural textbooks. The absence of a fixed blueprint liberated her. Instead of being confined to an initial layout, she allowed each new section to spark possibilities for the next. A freshly added room might inspire a new balcony. A widened hallway might call for a second-floor landing above it. She found joy in this constant evolution, treating the house not as a finished project, but as a living creation. The workers, following her lead, adapted to this rhythm, learning to embrace change even in the middle of construction. They became a team not of laborers fulfilling instructions, but of collaborators working alongside someone who saw architecture as a form of storytelling. As the expansions continued, outsiders began noticing unusual patterns, walls that shifted direction unexpectedly, rooms appearing in places where none had existed a week earlier, wings that seemed to blossom like branches from a growing tree. Locals whispered that the house had no center, no symmetry, no obvious purpose. What they could not see was the quiet logic behind Sarah's decisions, how every modification balanced comfort, movement, and aesthetic pleasure, how she shaped her environment to reflect her evolving sense of peace. By this stage, Llanada Villa had shed its identity as a modest farmhouse and begun its transformation into an architectural tapestry woven by one mind. The absence of formal plans did not weaken the house. It gave it a unique character, unpredictable yet harmonious, unconventional yet intentional. Every morning meeting, every sketch drawn at her desk, every decision made in the moment contributed to a structure that grew like an organic being rather than a fixed monument. The house was no longer simply expanding. It was awakening, preparing to become one of the most intriguing and misunderstood architectural creations in American history, not through superstition or legend, but through the quiet, deliberate choices of a woman who had finally allowed herself to create without limits. As the years passed, the house began to shed any resemblance to the modest rural home it once had been. Instead, it rose and stretched as if responding to an unseen rhythm, developing upward and outward at the same time, guided entirely by Sarah's imagination. What made this transformation remarkable was not simply its speed or scale, but the way each new idea seemed to blend into the next, with no regard for traditional rules of proportion, sequence, or architectural hierarchy. The house was no longer a project. It was becoming a living structure, one that evolved in unpredictable directions, adapting to every inspiration that crossed her mind. The earliest expansions were straightforward, an added story here, a widened room there, small adjustments that hinted at future ambition, but still felt rooted in conventional building logic. Yet, as she grew more confident in her role as designer, her decisions became bolder. Entire floors were raised above existing ones without the clean symmetry that architects normally enforced. Rooms sprouted off other rooms in irregular arrangements, breaking the expected sequence of hallways and entrances. A new staircase might climb at a gentle slope toward a landing, only for another set of steps to rise sharply in a different direction. Instead of correcting these irregularities, she embraced them, letting the structure dictate its own movement like a melody shifting into new keys. Her decorative decisions followed the same philosophy of exploration over conformity. A room finished one month in warm Victorian hues might be reinvented the next, with patterned woodwork inspired by an exhibit she had recently admired. Stained glass panels appeared in unexpected places, casting geometric patterns across walls that had been plain only weeks earlier. Freshly installed wallpapers were sometimes removed soon after, if she felt a different texture or motif carried more emotional weight. She collected imported materials, unusual trims, and intricate carvings, arranging them like a painter who never repeated the same palette twice. Instead of striving for harmony across the whole house, she allowed each space to express its own personality. With each experiment, the layout grew stranger to the eye of anyone familiar with traditional design. Rooms did not line up as expected. A door might open onto a narrow landing that led either downward into a cozy chamber or upward into a bright alcove positioned entirely outside the home's earlier footprint. The second floor did not match the first. The third did not match the second. And by the time new wings were built, even long-time workers had to keep mental maps of the pathways they had constructed. Yet, despite this irregularity, the house did not feel chaotic from the inside. It felt curious, layered, surprising, like wandering through a place that had grown naturally rather than one created by rigid planning. What made the house so captivating was the absence of external limits. There were no city codes dictating symmetry, no neighbors demanding uniformity, no committee insisting on stylistic coherence. Sarah had land, resources, and imagination, and those three elements allowed her to treat her property as a canvas without edges. She could expand east if the morning light in a new hallway appealed to her. She could build upward if she wanted a better view of the orchards. She could add secluded rooms for quiet reflection or open balconies to watch the landscape change with the seasons. The house responded to her impulses the way a growing organism responds to environmental shifts, adjusting, stretching, reshaping itself around her evolving vision. From the outside, these layers created a silhouette unlike any other in the region. Towers rose where none had been planned months earlier. Roof lines intersected at unusual angles. Sections appeared stacked in ways that made observers tilt their heads, as if searching for the logic behind the structure. But inside, those irregular forms produced an experience that felt immersive and intimate, like walking through the memory of someone's thoughts, unexpected, emotional, and deeply personal. By the time the fourth and fifth levels began to take shape, the house had transformed into a work of architecture that defied labels. It was not strictly Victorian, though it borrowed Victorian elements. It was not purely Queen Anne, though hints of that style drifted across certain facades. It had no singular theme, no fixed period, no boundary between inspiration and execution. Instead, it existed as a fluid expression of one woman's evolving relationship with space, light, and design. And as it continued to grow, the world around it began to whisper. Observers did not understand this unconventional masterpiece, and what people do not understand, they try to explain, often with stories more dramatic than the truth itself. But for now, in this chapter of its life, the house was simply becoming what it was always meant to be, a living work of art, unbound by rules, shaped by imagination, and expanding with the quiet confidence of something that knew it did not need to fit into any category at all. As the house expanded in every direction, its interior began developing a character that was unlike anything found in conventional architecture. The changing shape of the structure created shifts in elevation, unexpected transitions between wings, and mismatched floor heights that no traditional staircase could accommodate. What might have been a challenge for a typical builder became an opportunity for Sarah to reshape her environment according to her own needs and comforts. Her health required gentle movements and reduced strain on her joints, and with each passing year, the standard steep steps found in most Victorian homes became increasingly difficult for her to navigate. Instead of surrendering to discomfort, she redesigned the very idea of a staircase. The first of her unusually shallow steps appeared during a period of intense construction, when new rooms were rising above older ones and connecting corridors needed to bridge inconsistent levels. With each addition, the floor heights varied just enough to disrupt the natural flow of movement. She realized that stairs built to traditional proportions would force her to climb at angles that her body could no longer manage. So she instructed her workers to create stairways more like gentle ramps, extending the rise of a few feet across long, winding sequences of steps. One such staircase required 44 individual treads to gain only a modest elevation, an idea that would seem impractical to most, but became a signature feature of her home. These staircases reflected more than her physical needs. They mirrored the way the house itself was evolving. Each step felt like an extension of her approach to architecture, gradual, intuitive, and adaptive. Instead of forcing the new levels to align with the old, she allowed the discrepancies to exist and then shaped pathways around them, embracing the organic growth of the structure. Workers learned that a new staircase did not signify a fixed direction. It might curve, flatten, or shift depending on what rooms were added next. Their tools created steps that felt almost musical in their rhythm, rising and falling with the unpredictable heartbeat of the ever-changing house. As the stairways stretched and twisted into place, corridors followed a similar pattern. Some hallways ran in long, narrow stretches that seemed endless, only to open into surprisingly large rooms filled with windows and light. Others folded back on themselves, creating loops that connected different wings in ways that felt almost playful. What outsiders would later describe as a maze was, for Sarah, a natural result of the house's fluid growth. She was not trying to confuse anyone. She simply refused to tear down entire sections when they no longer fit neatly into a conventional plan. Instead, she built around them, layering new spaces atop older ones, letting the house age and expand in a style that carried the warmth of improvisation. The resulting layout produced rooms that served as transitions rather than destinations, spaces that were neither entirely private nor entirely public. These pass-through rooms linked one area of the house to another, becoming woven into the flow of daily life. Some contained large windows that spilled sunlight across the floorboards, while others possessed oddly placed doors or unexpected angles created when expansions collided. They were imperfect but alive, revealing the story of a home, shaped by constant curiosity and adjustment rather than rigid design. Even more intriguing were the sudden shifts in levels that developed as sections of the house rose and stretched at different speeds. A single hallway might dip slightly before rising again, responding to new foundations laid at varying depths. A room might sit half a foot above the one beside it, requiring a few additional steps that were added long after the original floorboards were installed. Instead of smoothing out these irregularities, she integrated them into the structure, accepting them as natural expressions of growth. The result was a house where every movement carried a sense of discovery, as if each corner and corridor held an ongoing dialogue between past choices and new ideas. These features, gentle stairways, elongated hallways, transitional rooms, shifting elevations, became the essence of La Villa. They were not designed for spectacle. They were born from practicality, comfort, and an artist's instinct to adapt rather than constrain. What people would one day interpret as signs of eccentricity or superstition were, in truth, reflections of a woman designing her world according to her own rhythm, guided by both physical necessity and a deeply intuitive relationship with her home. And as the house continued to rise, twist, and unfurl across the acres of land, each new step, hallway, and level carried the unmistakable imprint of its creator, subtle, thoughtful, and utterly unlike anything else in American architecture. As the house grew in shape and complexity, another transformation unfolded inside, one driven not by the need to connect rooms or bridge shifting levels, but by Sarah's fascination with light, color, and the natural world. La Villa gradually became a radiant interior landscape, a place where sunlight filtered through stained glass in patterns that shifted with every hour of the day, and where plants thrived in corners designed not merely for decoration, but for living, breathing beauty. What could have been a sprawling maze of timber and plaster instead evolved into a gallery of crafted details, glowing windows, polished wood, and quiet indoor gardens that softened every angle of the expanding home. Her passion for stained glass began as a small indulgence and soon grew into one of the house's defining features. She collected windows from renowned artisans, favoring vibrant pieces that scattered color across the floors like fragments of a painted sky. These windows appeared in unexpected places, on landings, in narrow corridors, embedded in walls between rooms, each one turning ordinary spaces into luminous compositions. Some bore intricate geometric designs, others showcased delicate botanical patterns, and a few contained inscriptions of poetry or thoughtful phrases that resonated with her inner world. When sunlight streamed through them, the house felt alive, its walls shifting with hues of amber, violet, emerald, and soft blues. Complementing these vivid works of glass was the warmth of the woodwork that framed nearly every room. She selected materials not only for durability, but for their ability to hold light in gentle tones. Polished redwood dominated the structure, its strength ensuring longevity and its grain adding natural beauty to even the simplest spaces. Carved moldings, detailed panels, and carefully matched patterns made the wood feel intentional rather than utilitarian. In some rooms, she incorporated repeating geometric motifs that aligned across door frames, wall trims, and ceilings, turning the surfaces into harmonious compositions that guided the eye from one shape to the next. Her appreciation for natural elements extended beyond materials and into the cultivation of living plants throughout the house. She filled indoor spaces with greenery, ferns, climbing vines, broad-leafed tropical varieties that thrived under the filtered light pouring through her stained glass. These indoor gardens were more than decoration. They created pockets of calm and freshness inside the sprawling structure, reminding everyone who entered that the house was not simply built to be explored, it was built to be felt. Over time, she designed specific areas to support her horticultural experiments, selecting corners with ideal warmth, creating open niches where plants could cascade down walls, and ensuring her workers installed enough windows to bathe each green haven in gentle illumination. To maintain these indoor oases, she devised a sophisticated water system unlike anything seen in typical homes of the era. Excess water drained through subtle grates built into the floors, traveling through pipes that carried it across the house and released it into the outdoor gardens. This system, cleverly disguised as part of the architecture, allowed her to tend to her plants without concern for overwatering or damage to the interior finishes. It reflected her practical intelligence and her desire to preserve both beauty and functionality without compromise. Every detail, even those hidden behind walls, echoed her commitment to shaping the house with thoughtfulness and care. The interior decoration amplified this delicate balance between artistry and structure, patterns repeated across walls and ceilings, not in uniform symmetry, but in intentional sequences that created movement throughout the rooms. Her choices in fabrics, finishes, and furniture were equally distinctive. Fabrics with rich textures, wallpaper that offered depth and subtle sheen, and furniture arranged to complement the light rather than the architectural form. The result was a home that felt curated with the sensitivity of a museum, yet lived in with the comfort of a personal retreat. By the time these features took full form, the house had become more than an architectural curiosity. It had transformed into an evolving composition of layered light, natural textures, and organic growth. Walking through its halls felt like traveling through a series of luminous scenes, each turning the environment into an art piece shaped by time, creativity, and an eye for beauty that guided every decision. Lianata Villa breathed with the movement of air through open windows, the shifting glow of stained glass, the rustle of leaves inside its rooms, and the warmth of hand-worked wood holding the entire structure together. This was not a house built merely to impress. It was a house built to feel alive. The rhythm of construction at Lianata Villa followed no predictable pattern, evolving instead with the same fluidity that shaped every corner of the house. Some years felt like an unbroken pulse of activity, hammers ringing from dawn until dusk, sawdust drifting through open doorways, new walls rising almost as quickly as old ones were altered. Workers moved from one task to the next with the steady confidence of a team accustomed to a project without a finish line. They slept on site, ate together, and lived within the framework they were helping create, their routines woven into the very timbers of the expanding home. In these stretches of constant progress, the house felt almost restless, eager to grow, eager to follow each idea as soon as it took form in Sarah's mind. Then, without warning, the intensity would dissolve into absolute stillness. Months would pass with no sound of construction, no footsteps on scaffolding, no wood being planed, no nails tapping against beams. These quiet periods puzzled outsiders, who assumed the work had stopped permanently. But for Sarah, these pauses were not interruptions. They were essential. She used them to walk the house slowly, absorbing the new spaces, studying how light shifted through the windows, how air moved through corridors, how one addition changed the experience of another. She treated the house like a living entity that needed time to settle before it could grow again. During these stretches of contemplation, she would refine her ideas, sketch new concepts, and mentally rework areas that no longer matched the evolving vision. It was precisely because the house grew in bursts, followed by long periods of reflection, that unusual architectural features emerged. Rooms appeared inside other rooms when she decided a once large space should be divided or repurposed without sacrificing the foundation that already existed. In some cases, she preferred to keep the original walls intact, enclosing them within a new design rather than demolishing them outright. These layered rooms, though unusual, revealed how she valued adaptation over destruction. She built forward, not backward. Windows occasionally found themselves opening into walls instead of open air. This happened not because she forgot their placement, but because new wings often rose where open views once existed. When a corridor was extended to connect a freshly added section, a window that had originally looked out over the garden might suddenly face a paneled hallway or the back of a staircase. Instead of removing these windows, she allowed them to remain as quiet markers of earlier stages in the home's growth, like tree rings preserved inside the trunk as the tree expands. Corridors that once led clearly from one room to another could, after several renovations, appear to lose their purpose entirely. A hallway might once have connected two major wings, but after new rooms filled the space around it, it became a narrow passage leading to a small alcove or turning sharply into a different floor level. Yet even these oddly placed hallways carried traces of thoughtful design. They were relics of the home's earlier shape, preserved rather than eliminated, allowing the building's past to coexist with its present. To observers, these changes seemed eccentric, even disordered, but the workers who lived there understood a deeper truth. The house grew in the same way an artist revises a painting. Instead of erasing entire sections, Sarah added layers, shifted perspectives, and built upon existing structure. What may have looked chaotic from the outside was, in reality, an evolving expression of creativity, one that favored transformation over uniformity and reinvention over rigid planning. The rhythm of the construction reflected her own process of thought. Inspiration came in waves. When a new idea took hold, building accelerated, filling the property with movement and noise. When the idea needed time to mature, the silence returned, giving her space to understand the new shape of the house before she determined its next phase. This shifting tempo allowed the structure to develop its signature character, a place where continuity and change coexisted, where rooms carried echoes of past intentions even as they adapted to new ones. Over time, the interplay of construction and contemplation shaped Leonardo Villa into something profoundly unique. It became a record of evolving ideas, a physical manifestation of creativity that refused to freeze into a single moment. The so-called strange features, the rooms within rooms, the windows into walls, the wandering hallways, were not hallmarks of confusion. They were the natural result of a home continuously rewritten, a place shaped not by disorder, but by the honest process of creation itself. As the house continued to stretch across its wide California landscape, one feature soon rose above all others, a towering structure that would become both the pride of its creator and the spark that ignited whispers throughout the valley. The central tower, eventually reaching 7 stories, stood like a vertical declaration of Sarah's architectural ambition. Unlike the rest of the home, which grew in curling tendrils of rooms and corridors, this tower climbed straight into the sky, challenging gravity and defying expectations for a private residence. It could be seen from orchards, from dirt roads, from passing carriages. It pierced the landscape with a confidence that demanded attention. Its creation was not a single event, but a process marked by reinvention. The tower was built, altered, torn down in sections, adjusted, reshaped, and rebuilt again. Workers joked that they knew its beams more intimately than the beams of their own houses. 16 different iterations rose and fell before Sarah felt the design captured what she envisioned. Sometimes a change was prompted by a detail others would have dismissed, a misaligned railing, the way wind moved around the structure, or a shadow that fell awkwardly across one of the landings. She studied these nuances carefully, treating the tower like a sculpture rather than a construction project. The workers learned that when she stood still at the base of the structure in quiet contemplation, another revision was likely on the way. Its height and frequent alterations did not go unnoticed. Locals who barely paid attention to the rest of the sprawling construction found their eyes drawn to the rising tower, watching its silhouette shift week by week. In an era when few women oversaw building projects of any kind, let alone the construction of the tallest private structure in the region, the sight invited curiosity. It stirred admiration in some, confusion in others, and fascination in nearly everyone who lived within sight of it. Carriage drivers began pointing it out to passengers as they traveled through the valley. Farm hands paused during work to observe new additions climbing upward. Children whispered to each other about the mysterious woman who lived behind the rising walls. The tower's persistent evolution created an unusual phenomenon. People began explaining it to themselves through stories. The constant reconstruction seemed strange, even excessive, and where facts were scarce, imagination rushed in. Neighbors who had never spoken to Sarah speculated about her intentions. Some claimed she was searching for the perfect view. Others insisted she was building a monument in her husband's honor, but many preferred more dramatic interpretations. The inconsistency of the tower, the way it rose and fell and rose again, encouraged theories that she was avoiding something, trapped by something, following instructions no one else could see. It was in these early murmurs that the first myths began taking shape. They were quiet at first, just small exchanges during market days or hushed remarks made as people walked the dusty roads bordering the property. The house was already unusual enough to attract attention, but the tower made it impossible to ignore. Its height made it a landmark, and its constant revision made it a mystery. People began referring to the property as the house that won't stop growing and the place where the floors changed shape. The more the tower shifted, the stronger the stories grew, each new rumor feeding on the uncertainty of the last. Unknown to those on the outside, the tower's redesigns reflected nothing more than Sarah's pursuit of harmony within a structure that was expanding rapidly in all directions. She wanted balance between the vertical and horizontal elements of the home, a focal point that grounded the sprawling wings. Creating that balance required experimentation, and experimentation took time, but the public, unable to see her quiet process of refinement, interpreted the changes as signs of something secretive or unsettled. The house, once simply a private creative retreat, was beginning to enter the realm of communal imagination. As the tower reached its final form, tall, confident, and structurally integrated with the rest of the house, it became a symbol not just of her vision, but of the widening gap between how the house was built and how the public understood it. The tower had grown from simple architectural ambition into an object of myth-making, marking the first moment when Leonardo Villa stepped out of its own walls and into the folklore of San Jose. And though Sarah remained silent about her intentions, the tower spoke loudly to those who watched it rise, becoming the earliest chapter in a much larger legend that would eventually eclipse the reality she had so carefully crafted. When the ground began to tremble in the early morning hours of April 1906, the house that had grown for 2 decades with such confidence suddenly faced a force far greater than any architectural challenge Sarah had ever imagined. The San Francisco earthquake sent shockwaves tearing through the valley, a violent shudder that twisted foundations, splintered beams, and turned entire neighborhoods into rubble. Llanada Villa, with its layered floors, intricate additions, and tall central tower, bore the full impact of the disaster. What had once felt solid underfoot lurched and groaned, as if the house itself were bracing against the upheaval. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Wings that had taken years to refine collapsed within seconds, their carefully crafted rooms crumbling into heaps of shattered wood and broken masonry. Entire sections of the upper floors folded into one another, creating jagged openings where walls had once stood. The tower, The proud vertical spine of the estate fell with such force that part of the surrounding structure went down with it, sending dust billowing through the air and leaving behind a gaping void where its silhouette had once pierced the sky. Furniture toppled, windows shattered into glittering fragments, and hallways that had once carried warmth and quiet footsteps were now blocked by debris. The house lost an astonishing portion of its volume that day. Estimates put the number of vanished rooms in the hundreds, spaces that had been layered one upon another, now reduced to ruins or rendered inaccessible. Their original paths cut off by collapsed frameworks, chimneys toppled, staircases cracked apart, and ceilings dropped onto floors that buckled beneath them. The intricate water systems designed to nourish plants ran openly through exposed pipes, no longer protected by the walls that once concealed them. The damage was not limited to dramatic destruction. It seeped into the small details as well. Delicate carvings splintered, stained glassworks were buried beneath fallen beams. Floors that had once carried the subtle vibration of footsteps now creaked under new, uneven weight. Yet within this devastation lay the origins of what would later be interpreted as strange architectural decisions. Doors that once opened into bright rooms now led to empty air where floors had disappeared. Staircases that had once connected perfectly to upper landings now climbed toward broken edges, or abruptly ended in midair. Windows looked into walls, not because they had been designed that way, but because those walls had been hastily sealed to protect the interior from weather after entire wings disappeared. These features, the ones that would eventually fuel myths of traps, confusion, and supernatural intent, were simply the visible scars of a natural disaster that had reshaped the house from the inside out. When Sarah finally returned to assess the damage, the sight was overwhelming. What had once been a vibrant architectural organism, growing, evolving, breathing with creativity, now lay partially broken, stitched together by fragments and precarious remnants of her former vision. She walked through the remains with steady, quiet resolve. The idea of demolishing and rebuilding from the ground up crossed her mind, but the weight of the years, her own declining health, and the immensity of the loss convinced her that starting over would be too large a battle to undertake. Instead, she chose a different path. She asked her workers not to reconstruct what had been destroyed, but to secure what remained. They stabilized weakened beams, sealed open walls, locked doors that now led outside, and boarded stairways that had lost their destination. Rooms were closed off, corridors shortened, and entire sections of the home frozen in their damaged state. The house no longer grew, it adjusted. Its evolution shifted from ambition to preservation. Additions stopped not because inspiration had faded, but because the disaster had carved a boundary Sarah no longer wished to cross. Instead of gazing upward toward new levels or outward toward fresh wings, she directed her team to mend what could be saved and protect the structure from further harm. The earthquake became the dividing line between two eras of the house's life. Before it, the home expanded with restless curiosity, each year adding new layers of intention. After it, the house settled into itself, carrying the weight of its history and the quiet acceptance of its altered form. What had been a growing masterpiece became a wounded but enduring structure, shaped not only by imagination, but by resilience. The scars left behind, the abrupt doors, the unfinished floors, the stairways without destinations, became part of the home's truth. They told the story of a turning point when creation gave way to survival, and when a once expanding sanctuary became a testament to endurance in the face of nature's power. In the years following the earthquake, the house entered a quieter, more introspective phase, one shaped not by expansion, but by repair, resilience, and the acceptance of irreversible change. Llanada Villa, once growing with the confidence of a structure constantly reinventing itself, now carried the marks of its trauma in ways both visible and hidden. Instead of reaching outward into new construction, the house began to fold inward, sealing its wounds with careful adjustments that transformed its interior into a labyrinth defined not by ambition, but by the need to protect what remained. Many of the staircases that had once gently carried visitors between levels were abruptly blocked off. Some ended at sheer drop-offs created when the floors above collapsed. Others led to rooms that no longer existed, or opened onto spaces exposed to the elements. To prevent accidents and preserve the stability of what was left, Sarah instructed her workers to board these stairways, covering them with fitted planks that blended into the surrounding walls. Each closure was like a stitched seam on a fragile surface, functional, necessary, and quietly poignant. These once inviting climbs became silent reminders of floors that had fallen away and wings that could not be rebuilt. Doors met a similar fate. Many of them, originally meant to open into bright spaces or to connect one wing to another, had lost their purpose entirely. A door that once led to a balcony now opened onto open air where the balcony had collapsed. A door that had once connected two hallways now faced a void where the second hallway used to stand. Instead of tearing out these portals, the workers sealed them, sometimes with thick boards, other times with layers of plaster that disguised their former function. Some remained locked permanently, their handles still intact, but their frames reinforced. These sealed thresholds dotted the house like echoes of earlier chapters, marking the places where the home had once breathed freely before the earthquake forced it to close in on itself. Passageways underwent similar transformations. Corridors that had once offered smooth transitions between wings became dead ends, their routes interrupted by missing rooms or structural weaknesses the quake had left behind. Some hallways were braced with new beams, their ceilings lowered to prevent collapse. Others were blocked altogether, masked behind wooden panels that merged seamlessly with the surrounding walls. Walking through the house now meant encountering frequent shifts in direction, narrow bottlenecks, and sudden turns where straight routes had once existed. The flow of movement through the home became less intuitive, shaped by the limitations of what could be safely preserved. These choices created the illusion, later exaggerated by storytellers, that the house was intentionally designed to confuse or mislead. But the truth was far more grounded. After the earthquake, Sarah's priorities changed. She no longer sought to expand the structure or explore bold new ideas. The energy that once fueled creative experimentation shifted instead toward maintaining stability, preserving her sanctuary in whatever form it could safely hold. The earthquake had not shaken her interest in architecture, but it had reshaped her relationship with the house. The thrill of designing new wings was replaced with the quiet resolve to protect what she had built. She faced this new chapter with a steady, measured patience. Instead of dreaming up fresh additions, she spent her days studying cracked plaster, assessing weakened beams, and directing repairs. Her workers became caretakers as much as craftsmen, reinforcing fragile walls, reattaching loose fixtures, and replacing sections too damaged to salvage. The house had become more vulnerable, and with that vulnerability came a new kind of attention. Less imaginative, perhaps, but deeply devoted. The sealing of rooms, doors, and corridors gave the house a sense of being partially hidden from itself. It was as though the structure had folded its injured parts inward, closing certain paths while allowing others to remain open. The once expansive home now held a more introspective character, a place defined by what remained rather than what could be added. Its complexity no longer stemmed from constant construction, but from the layered interplay between its intact sections and the preserved remnants of its damaged ones. Through this transformation, Leonardo Villa changed from an ever-growing architectural experiment into a home marked by resilience and memory. Each boarded staircase, sealed doorway, and redirected corridor told the quiet story of adaptation, of a house that had endured immense upheaval and, under the guidance of its creator, found a way to continue standing. As the house settled into its post-earthquake form, another transformation began, one that took place not within its walls but around its perimeter. With every passing year, Sarah felt the world outside press a little closer. Curious onlookers walked the dusty roads, hoping to glimpse the unusual architecture rising beyond the orchards. Local gossip, once an occasional murmur, grew into a constant hum as stories drifted from farm to farm. The house had become a spectacle in the eyes of the community, even though its creator had never sought an audience. To preserve the quiet she cherished, she turned to the landscape itself, shaping a barrier that would shield her sanctuary from the mounting attention. She began planting dense hedges around the property, rows of tall, carefully maintained greenery that grew thicker and higher with each season. Unlike wooden fences or stone walls, these living borders blended into the natural environment, their leaves absorbing sound and softening the lines of the estate. They served multiple purposes: privacy, protection, and the preservation of the quiet atmosphere she valued. As they matured, the hedges created a secluded world within the farmhouse grounds, filtering sunlight into gentle patterns and muffling the noise of wagons and conversations from the road. These hedges had a subtle but powerful effect on the public's imagination. Their growing height made the property seem not only private, but mysterious. People could no longer casually glance into the yard or trace the silhouette of new repairs. They saw only a rising green wall that concealed the intricate structure behind it. In an era when secrecy sparked more interest than openness, the natural barrier fed speculation. Residents began sharing exaggerated tales of what might be unfolding behind the leafy screen. What had once been idle curiosity turned into something closer to fascination, fueled by the sight of a home intentionally hidden from view. The hedges also changed how the house was discussed beyond the immediate neighborhood. Travelers passing through the valley found themselves pointing out the impenetrable green border, long before they ever caught sight of a chimney or rooftop. Carriages slowed as drivers explained that a peculiar residence lay somewhere beyond the dense foliage. The fewer details available, the more dramatic the retellings became. Some claimed the house was still expanding despite the earthquake, its walls shifting under the cover of trees. Others insisted the property held secrets too unusual to be revealed in daylight. The isolation created by those hedges allowed imaginations to flourish unchecked. What grew most rapidly during this time was not the house itself, which had largely ceased expanding, but the stories surrounding it. The community shaped its own version of the estate, crafting narratives more elaborate than the reality Sarah lived each day. Though she rarely appeared in public, her absence became part of the legend, interpreted by outsiders as proof that something extraordinary was taking place inside. In truth, she simply valued her privacy, preferring the quiet companionship of her workers and the familiar paths inside her home to the attention of strangers. Yet it was precisely her silence that allowed rumors to take on a life of their own. The hedges, once intended to create peace, inadvertently intensified the home's allure. They framed the property like the borders of a storybook illustration, giving the impression that something unusual waited within. Visitors to San Jose reported hearing about the hidden house, the shrouded mansion, or the estate that no one sees. Even those who lived nearby often admitted they had not witnessed more than a glimpse of its rooftops rising above the green barrier. In a region still rural and sparsely populated, the house became a cultural landmark, not because of what was known, but because of what was unknown. Inside the walls of greenery, however, daily life remained simple. Workers continued their routines, maintaining the grounds, repairing damaged areas, and assisting Sarah in the calm, measured way they had for years. The outside world speculated endlessly, but the interior world stayed steady, gentle, private. The house did not crave attention, it resisted it. And yet, unintentionally, it became a symbol of intrigue precisely because so little of it could be seen. In creating a barrier meant to protect her solitude, Sarah had strengthened the house's identity in the public imagination. The hedges became as much a part of its legend as its unusual architecture. They marked the boundary between truth and myth, between a woman seeking quiet and a community eager for stories. And beyond those tall, whispering walls, the house continued to hold its secrets, not through intention, but through the quiet power of being unseen. In the final stretch of its evolution, Llanada Villa settled into a kind of dignified stillness. The years of constant activity, of boards carried past half-built rooms and sketches redrawn on the porch each morning, slowly gave way to a quieter rhythm. The house no longer reached outward with new wings or upward with added floors. Instead, it rested in the form shaped by decades of imagination, repairs, and resilience. Though the earthquake had halted its growth, the structure remained vast and extraordinary, its many rooms holding echoes of the creativity that once filled them. Even without new additions, the house seemed to breathe with its own history, the walls retaining a quiet grandeur that spoke to the vision behind every beam and staircase. As Sarah aged, her focus shifted from shaping the house to simply living within it. She moved through rooms that bore the traces of earlier ideas, unfinished corners, corridors leading to sealed spaces, doorways that hinted at rooms long closed off. These spaces were not forgotten mistakes, but paused chapters, reminders of a time when inspiration moved faster than construction. Workers who had spent much of their lives under her direction continued tending to the estate, becoming not only employees but companions who understood the home as intimately as she did. Their routines held the house together, oiling hinges, repairing loose panels, sweeping long corridors, and maintaining the quiet harmony of a place that had become both workplace and refuge. Life inside the mansion took on a steady, measured tempo. The creak of wooden floors, the rustle of hedges outside, the filtered sunlight through stained glass, all of it created a gentle atmosphere that matched the slower pace of its owner. No longer fueled by new design ideas or large-scale building projects, the house became a sanctuary of familiar corners and soft lighting. Servants moved quietly through the halls, tending to daily tasks and ensuring that her environment remained comfortable. Some areas were used frequently, warmed by lamps and footsteps, while others remained untouched for weeks, retaining the suspended feeling of rooms left mid-thought, as though construction might resume at any moment. These incomplete rooms carried their own quiet poetry. A wall partly paneled, waiting for a final coat of finish. A ceiling beam, exposed where a section had once been removed for renovation but never fully rebuilt. A doorway framed but never fitted with a door. These fragments of ideas were not signs of neglect. They were remnants of a creative process that had simply slowed with age. Each unfinished space held a story of a moment when she had envisioned something new but no longer had the strength or desire to push it forward. They remained as they were, suspended in time, soft reminders that the house had once been a place of constant imagining. The household staff understood their roles in this new era with quiet loyalty. They prepared meals, maintained the gardens, and ensured that everything inside the sprawling structure remained functional. The mansion, despite its scale, never felt empty or abandoned. Instead, it felt gently inhabited, its life defined not by construction noise, but by the presence of those who cared for it. Servants shared meals together in the back rooms, laughed quietly over small stories, and filled the home with a warmth that balanced the stillness. They tended to Sarah with respect, helping her navigate the long hallways, and ensuring she remained comfortable in the rooms she favored most. In these later years, Leonata Villa became more than a creation. It became a companion. Its winding paths, its shifting floors, its intricate glasswork, and its preserved scars all mirrored the life of the woman who built it. She spent her days moving through familiar routes, pausing to rest in sunlit corners or to study the play of colors cast by her stained glass windows. The house no longer surprised her with new spaces. Instead, it offered the comfort of known shapes and the quiet reassurance of a place that had grown through her imagination and endured through her challenges. The atmosphere of the estate during this time held a sense of introspective calm. It felt like the final pages of a long story, not an ending marked by loss, but one filled with the soft glow of memory. No hammers echoed from the upper floors, no scaffolding shifted outside, only the gentle sounds of life within remained. Leonata Villa stood as a grand yet peaceful structure, carrying within its walls the layered history of decades, the creativity that shaped it, the earthquake that scarred it, the hands that built it, and the quiet resilience that kept it standing. In these closing years, the house was no longer a project. It had become a haven, one that sheltered its owner, its workers, and the fading notes of a once unbounded vision. When Sarah's long life finally reached its gentle conclusion in 1922, Leonata Villa entered a chapter unlike any that had come before. For the first time in decades, the house existed without the guiding presence that had shaped every beam, every window, every winding hallway. Its rooms, once filled with movement and quiet purpose, stood still. The routines of the workers continued for a short while, but soon even their familiar footsteps faded as the estate shifted into the hands of those who had inherited her property. What awaited them inside was not the legendary labyrinth whispered about in town, nor the polished grandeur one might expect from such a vast home. Instead, they found a structure that was both remarkable and bewildering, equal parts impressive and impractical. The sheer scale of the house overwhelmed even seasoned appraisers. They walked through corridors that twisted unexpectedly, stepped into rooms that led nowhere, and entered spaces that had likely not been touched in years. Some rooms carried the refined elegance of stained glass and polished wood. Others felt frozen in half-finished stages of construction, walls waiting for final touches that would never come. Entire sections remained closed off, sealed after the earthquake, and left untouched for decades. Dust settled over banisters and carpets, and the quiet that filled the house felt heavy, as though the building itself was adjusting to its sudden solitude. To the heirs responsible for managing the estate, the mansion posed more challenges than opportunities. The upkeep of such an enormous structure demanded resources far beyond what they wished to invest. Every corridor, every closed-off room, every staircase boarded for safety required attention. Inside, the house held no valuable furnishings, nothing of monetary worth to offset the cost of restoring or maintaining it. Sarah had lived simply within her walls, and much of her personal belongings had been distributed among her closest friends and family long before the estate was evaluated. Appraisers tried to measure the value of the property, but the architecture defied conventional assessment. Its layout was confusing, built more on intuition than on uniform design. Some areas lacked practical plumbing or safe electrical routes. Others were structurally sound but so oddly shaped that they served no modern purpose. What remained clear was that the land itself, 45 acres in a rapidly developing region, held far more financial promise than the labyrinthine structure sitting upon it. Potential buyers toured the estate and left with polite but uncertain expressions. They saw the scope of the house, its many thousands of square feet, and recognized the challenge rather than the possibility. Restoring the residence to modern standards would require immense investment. Remodeling it into something conventional would require gutting much of its unique character, and leaving it as is offered no practical use. Insurance assessors considered the property a risk. Developers considered it a burden. Private buyers considered it a puzzle too costly to solve. In auction listings, the mansion was described not as a grand home, but as a complicated structure in need of extensive repairs. The ornate details that had once brought Sarah joy seemed like obstacles to those looking for functionality. The sealed rooms, the patched hallways, the remnants of earthquake damage that had never been fully addressed, all of it contributed to the perception that the structure was more trouble than treasure. When bidding finally took place, the reactions reflected this sentiment. The house itself was deemed nearly worthless, a relic too vast and unusual to fit easily into the needs of the time. What bidders truly wanted was the land, the wide, fertile acreage that could be subdivided, developed, or repurposed. In the eyes of the market, the house was an encumbrance, something to be dealt with rather than cherished. It was a sharp contrast to the home's origins as a place of hope and creativity, and an even sharper contrast to the aura of mystery it had gained among the public. To the world beyond the hedges, the house had already become a legend. But inside the auction hall, stripped of stories and evaluated purely through practical eyes, it was seen as a burden, a structure too unusual to carry its own worth. And so, Llanada Villa entered its new life not as a prized architectural wonder, but as an unwanted complication, waiting quietly for someone who could see more than cost and inconvenience, someone who could understand the potential hidden beneath its worn floors and sealed doors. When the estate finally passed into new hands after the auction, it fell not to a developer or a preservationist, but to a pair of opportunistic entrepreneurs, John and Mamie Brown. They approached the empty mansion with a different vision from the heirs, the appraisers, or even the neighbors who had watched it grow for decades. Where others saw impracticality, the Browns saw possibility. Where others noticed sealed rooms and confusing layouts, they noticed atmosphere. And where others dismissed the structure as an expensive burden, they recognized a stage already half-built, waiting only for a story bold enough to capture the public imagination. From the moment they stepped inside, the Browns understood that the house's unusual architecture would be difficult to explain through practical terms. They also understood something else. The public rarely craved practical explanations. People wanted mystery. They wanted drama. They wanted a narrative that transformed the towering, twisting structure into something more than a byproduct of decades of creative construction. And so, the Browns began crafting a tale, not one grounded in the truth of Sarah's love for architecture, but one that painted her as a haunted recluse driven by forces far beyond the realm of design. Their story needed a beginning that captured attention. They resurrected an imaginary medium from Boston, inventing accounts of a séance in which Sarah was supposedly told she was followed by the spirits of those whose lives had been taken by Winchester rifles. They claimed this unseen advisor urged her to move west and build a house designed to confuse these restless presences, a place whose shifting hallways and abrupt endings would ensure they could never find her. The idea was dramatic, evocative, and perfectly suited to a public already primed by decades of gossip and fascination. To strengthen the tale, they embellished the house's features with symbolic meaning. The boarded staircases and sealed doors, simple remnants of earthquake damage and post-disaster repairs, became deliberate spiritual traps. The odd layout, shaped by constant construction and adaptation, became a weapon against invisible pursuers. Rooms within rooms, windows facing walls, levels shifting unexpectedly. These were recast not as architectural improvisations, but as defenses in a supernatural battle no one else could see. Even the number 13, which appeared occasionally in the house's design through chance or repetition, was transformed into a sacred motif of superstition. The Browns emphasized every occurrence of the number as evidence of ritualistic obsession. Whether or not the details aligned with reality mattered far less than how effectively they evoked wonder and fear. The more the Browns refined their story, the more irresistible it became. They understood the power of presentation, so they carefully curated the house during tours. Guests were led through dim hallways where the lighting cast elongated shadows. Guides whispered dramatic lines at the foot of staircases that ended abruptly, pausing just long enough for visitors to fill the silence with their own imaginations. Rooms were introduced not as architectural experiments, but as places where nightly séances allegedly took place. Even the gardener's former quarters became a supposed chamber of spiritual communication, simply because the legend demanded such a room. With every retelling, the myth grew stronger. Visitors left with wide eyes and quickened pulses. Writers and journalists began repeating the Browns' version of events, sometimes adding embellishments of their own. Fictional novels took inspiration from the tale, creating a cycle in which the house fueled new stories, and those stories were then used as evidence during the tours. What had started as a creative fabrication became accepted truth for millions who passed through the doors. The Browns had, intentionally or not, turned the house into a reflection of the public's fascination with the uncanny. Llanada Villa, once shaped by the quiet vision of a private woman, was reborn as the Winchester Mystery House, a place where architecture was overshadowed by imagination, and where the lines between fact and myth blurred almost completely. The mansion no longer existed simply as it was. It existed as people believed it to be, a labyrinth of fear, a monument to restless spirits, a structure designed not by artistic impulse, but by supernatural dread. In crafting this legend, the Browns had transformed the house into a ghost of itself. The original purpose, the real story, and the quiet genius of its creation were buried beneath layers of storytelling, too enticing for the world to ignore. The mansion became a spectacle, an attraction wrapped in myth, its true history overshadowed by the fiction that had made it famous. As the decades passed, the house that once grew with the rhythm of its creator's imagination settled into a new identity, one shaped not by construction crews or spontaneous sketches, but by caretakers, historians, and the endless flow of visitors drawn to its strange beauty. The Browns' descendants continued managing the property, refining it into a full-fledged museum, one that stood at the crossroads of preservation and performance. What had once been a private refuge and later a spectacle shaped by sensational storytelling was now transformed into a cultural landmark, its halls echoing with guided voices and curious footsteps rather than the steady work of craftsmen. Maintaining such a vast structure demanded constant attention. Carpenters, electricians, and restoration experts became the new stewards of the house, working to stabilize shifting beams, repair weather-worn facades, and preserve the fragile materials that had survived both time and disaster. Where sections had once been left sealed or forgotten, restoration teams reopened them carefully, reinforcing weakened frames and cataloging original elements. Antique furniture, chosen to match the house's era and aesthetic, filled rooms that had long stood empty. Some of these pieces were acquired to reflect Victorian styles, Others replaced objects removed during the initial clearing of the estate. Every restored trim, polished banister, and carefully recreated room added to the sense that the house wasn't merely being preserved, it was being curated into a living museum. The grounds themselves underwent dramatic change. The original 45 acres that had once given the house room to expand were slowly carved away as the surrounding region developed. Neighborhoods grew denser, roads widened, and farmland disappeared. Parcel by parcel, the land around the property was sold or repurposed, until only 5 acres remained to cradle the once sprawling estate. Where orchards and open fields once stretched outward, the house now stood amid modern buildings and pavement, its Victorian silhouette rising like a relic caught between eras. The contrast only amplified its allure, a bizarre, towering monument surrounded by a landscape it no longer recognized. Through all of this, the myths crafted by the Browns continued to thrive. Millions of visitors entered the mansion each decade, eager to hear the stories of unseen spirits, unfinished rituals, and stairways designed to confuse supernatural pursuers. Tour guides repeated the now famous legends, their voices echoing down narrow corridors and across ornate rooms. The narrative was gripping, dramatic, and unforgettable, and for many, it overshadowed the truth. Yet even as the myth grew, so did an undercurrent of scholarship, determined to bring the real story to light. Historians, archivists, and architectural researchers began digging into the origins of the house, piecing together documents, letters, and eyewitness accounts that revealed a more grounded but equally compelling history. They uncovered details about Sarah's love for architecture, her daily involvement in construction, her charitable contributions, and the practical reasons behind many of the home's unusual features. They traced earthquake damage, structural adaptations, and unfinished expansions, showing how these elements had been reinterpreted as supernatural puzzles. Their work painted Sarah not as an eccentric recluse communicating with spirits, but as a creative, resilient woman who built according to passion and necessity rather than fear. The effort to shift public perception became a delicate battle. The myths had become inseparable from the mansion's identity, drawing crowds and fueling a multi-million-dollar tourism industry. Complete erasure of these stories was neither possible nor desired. Instead, historians aimed for balance, revealing the truth without extinguishing the sense of wonder that made the house such a powerful cultural symbol. Gradually, museum displays began incorporating factual accounts. Guided tours offered glimpses of the historical record alongside the legendary tales. Exhibits highlighted architectural innovation, the effects of the earthquake, and Sarah's role in shaping the estate. In doing so, the house became not merely a backdrop for ghost stories, but a window into one woman's extraordinary relationship with design. And yet, the mansion continues to exist in the liminal space between myth and reality. Visitors arrive eager for a brush with the uncanny, while others come seeking a deeper understanding of its construction. The halls carry both energies easily, holding the tension with a dignity that reflects its layered past. Its staircases, sealed doors, and intricate rooms still spark imagination. Its preserved architecture still speaks of the mind that created it. The truth does not diminish the mystery, it enriches it. 100 years after Sarah's life came to a close, her home stands as a testament to endurance, creativity, and the complex ways stories shape perception. It is a museum wrapped in folklore, a landmark embraced by both scholars and storytellers. The Winchester Mystery House lives on because it offers two kinds of experience at once: the thrill of exploring a place shaped by legend, and the quiet awe of encountering a structure built by human hands, guided by vision rather than fear. In that layered existence, between what people imagine and what history reveals, the house continues to thrive, carrying its past into the present with the same resilience that allowed it to endure every change, every loss, and every retelling of its story.